Hello everyone! On October 22nd, the FAA held a meeting of their Drone Advisory Committee, or DAC, and they live streamed that meeting both on YouTube and Facebook. And while I encourage everyone to go watch that 2.5 hour long video and read the accompanying ebook that they posted ahead of the meeting, I know most of you don't have the time or the patience to sit through the entire thing, so I thought I'd try to make a video where I hit on the highlights of that meeting. So just in case you're not familiar with it, according to the FAA, the DAC is a broad-based, long-term federal advisory committee that provides the FAA with advice on key UAS integration issues by helping to identify challenges and prioritize improvements. The committee helps to create broad support for an overall integration strategy and vision. And I'll also give you a link to the DAC charter down in the description of this video if you really want to get into the details of what the DAC is. Now, the actual DAC meeting is basically just a formality. All of the real work happens in meetings ahead of time and in the tasking groups and subgroup meetings. So before this meeting even happens, they publish what they call this ebook. And as I mentioned before, I encourage you all to take a look at that entire ebook, and you'll get a much better sense of what the DAC has been up to by reading that. During the opening remarks, Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao mentioned that there are 75 applications applying for the 6 vacant seats that are available on the DAC. If you look in the ebook, it lists the current DAC members, and it shows the 6 vacancies, including the stakeholder group that each vacancy is associated with. And if you look really close, you'll see that it's stacked very heavily with people from commercial industry, both manned and unmanned. And we will get into this a little bit more later, but there doesn't appear to be any category for recreational flyers, nor is there any vacancy for, well, for a group that doesn't exist, right? The closest thing we have to recreational representation right now is the AMA, and they're just listed down here at the bottom in the other category. So the FAA stated that they hope to have new members in place for the next DAC meeting, which I think is currently scheduled for early next year, probably sometime in the February timeframe. At least that's when the previous spring one was. So I'm guessing we'll hear more either at that meeting or maybe just before the possible February 2021 DAC meeting about who may be able to fill those 6 vacant slots on the DAC. So back at the DAC meeting in February 2020, the FAA tasked the DAC with answering the following question. What are ways we can help the drone community fully adopt the safety culture that is so ingrained in manned aviation? And given that task, the DAC created 4 subgroups to find answers to that question. And those 4 subgroups are, number 1, traditional manned aviation, number 2, recreational community operators, number 3, the small commercial operators, and number 4, the national UAS operators. So the first group that was up to give their presentation to the FAA was the manned aviation subgroup. And they presented 3 recommendations to the FAA, none of which really caught my attention. It was pretty clear that they're mostly thinking of like large-scale commercial operations in all their recommendations and not really small UAS recreational users like myself. So after they gave their presentation, the next group that was up was the recreational/community subgroup. And this group obviously is much more relevant to myself, and thus they had the most interesting content as far as I was concerned. The group admitted that they had a lot of crossover between their subgroup and the small commercial operators group, which the FPVFC president Dave Messina was on. And because there was a lot of crossover between these 2 groups, I can't help but believe that a lot of the good things that I saw coming from this recreational group, that Dave possibly had some hand in influencing those and making them show up in the document. The first big noteworthy item that I saw or that really caught my attention was when they stated Aside from nefarious acts and outlier incidents, the subgroup could not identify a repeatable history of significant safety issues to mitigate. Therefore, the subgroup's recommendations focus on how the FAA can educate, reduce potential risks, and build rapport and trust with recreational operators while integrating in the NAS. So to me, this is basically calling out the fact that recreational use of UAS over the past 100 years has been extremely safe. And thus, even the question the tasking group was asked was a little bit misleading or a little bit unnecessary. So I really hope the FAA also notices that this particular sentence and really understands what they're saying here. They're saying, hey, FAA, that your question, you're even asking us the wrong question, or it's a leading question, and this isn't the question we think we should be answering. So then that group goes on to say that the FAA should work with the community, influencers, events, and grassroots efforts to build trust among the drone community. The subgroup strongly recommends FAA's participation at UAS recreational events. So here you can see that the subgroup is suggesting that the FAA do a much better job of building trust with the community. And I know as far as the FPV community goes, there's basically no trust at all of the FAA. So the FAA has a lot of work to do, a lot of work ahead of them to try to even attempt to gain the trust of these recreational flyers. And when the FAA published their remote ID NPRM last December, if there was any trust of the FAA, they totally lost it with the publication of that. I'll be very curious to see if the FAA does reach out to any influencers, as they would call them, like Bruce Simpson, Mr. Steele, Joshua Bardwell. I mean, each of those has somewhere around 200,000 plus subscribers on YouTube, and probably way more people that actually follow them than that. But maybe those numbers are just way too tiny. They're not at all what this subgroup's thinking about, but be interesting to find out what happens with that. The group goes on to state, the FAA should attend events with the primary intent of education and trust building, and not to impose their authority on regulatory and policy matters. So this would also be interesting to see what would happen if the FAA, say, were to show up at some large recreational events. Well, yeah, recreational events like the multi-GPIO, where the FAA is not very trusted there at all, and probably wouldn't be very welcome. But it'd be interesting to see what would happen if they did show up there. Could go a long way to building trust. I don't know. Depends what they did. This group also made another very important statement. They said that the FAA should further integrate recreational UAS manufacturers, community-based organizations like the FPV Freedom Coalition, and recreational stakeholder leaders into its advisory and policy processes, so that this long-standing and evolving segment of recreational aviation has an equivalent seat at the table to segments of manned aviation. And now, I would add to the end of that, not only just segments of manned aviation, but also commercial aviation, because the commercial interests, there's quite a lot of them on the DAC already. Right now, recreational use of UAS seems kind of forgotten when it comes to regulations. Then anything the FAA publishes, there's not a whole lot that they're talking about recreational pilots. It seems really focused on commercial stuff. And as I mentioned in the beginning, there's no group as part of the DAC that represents recreational flyers, only the AMA being stuck down there at the bottom in the other category, despite recreational UAS as having the largest numbers. So I totally agree with what this subgroup is saying here, that the DAC needs to add more recreational representation, and that the FAA really needs to dedicate more seats at the table to the recreational users. So the group also reiterated that one size does not fit all, which has sort of been a theme through this entire meeting. That when it comes to UAS regulations, I I agree. Yeah, regulations should be based on risk, and the risk of your tiny whoop, 30, 40 gram, whatever it is, drone flying around in your backyard is not the same as, say, you're trying to fly a drone to deliver organ transplants to a hospital, or flying a large-scale model aircraft at an AMA field, or someone trying to fly miles and miles and miles with beyond visual line of sight. One regulation is not going to simply cover all of that. So different activities have different risks and thus deserve different regulations. And finally, this group mentioned that the FAA should educate the general public to help promote a culture of safety through a greater understanding and acceptance of UAS, which, yes, absolutely. The public currently has some sort of unreasonable fear of drones, or when they hear the word drones, they think of something that is scary or is spying on people, which they're not doing. So if there's anything the FAA can do to educate the public and the population to show that drones can be a positive thing, show them in a positive light. Perhaps if that were the case, then many cities and states wouldn't be so quick to create their own regulations banning drones from parks and things like that. So that brings us to the presentation from the third subgroup, which is the Small Commercial Operators subgroup. And this one was given by Dave Messina, who's the president of the FPV Freedom Coalition. So even though he is not officially a member of the Drone Advisory Committee, he was able to get a seat on the subcommittee and ended up being the one who was giving the presentation. And as you can see, he's been working very hard as part of the subcommittee to give the perspective of a recreational FPV pilot, and has had some success in doing that. And Dave has also applied to become a member of the DAC, and hopefully, fingers crossed, that'll happen sometime, even though there are no official vacancies on the DAC for recreational representation. But like we mentioned just a little bit ago, the recreational subgroup did tell the FAA that recreational users need more representation on things like the DAC. So, maybe. So one of the highlights of what Dave was presenting was that he mentioned there are approximately 1.3 million recreational pilots in the USA. And that's 7 times the number of commercial operators in the United States. And yet there's only one DAC member representing a small portion of those recreational users. So how does that make any sense? So this subgroup recommended that a FRAT, or Flight Risk Assessment tool, be used by small commercial operators before every time they take flight. And for example, like if you're currently used to the Lance app, like it could ask you a series of flight risk assessment questions before you fly, and they stressed that this would be a view only kind of thing. You wouldn't submit your answers and have those be sent off to the FAA. This is not something for tracking you, it's just to help you realize whether or not what you're doing has an acceptable risk or not. So let's see, one final highlight from this group was the statement, while the safety culture small commercial subgroup recognizes the inherent risks of integrating UAS in the national airspace, it is important to note small commercial UAS operations have had 0 deaths in the United States. So just like what the recreational group was saying, they're pointing out here that it's very hard to beat a perfect safety record when it comes to deaths caused by UAS in the United States. So again, we have to ask, what are the risks that UAS pose, and where's the risk assessment that the FAA is required to do before justifying increased regulations? And that brings us to the final group presentation here from the National UAS Operators. So this group talked about the fact that complex activities should require more policies, more safety policies and procedures, and less complex beyond visual line of sight activities and line of sight activities should have a more graduated approach, to which I completely agree. Again, this is sort of saying that one size doesn't fit all. There should be much less regulation involved in something like flying a model aircraft at an AMA field, or recreationally flying FPV in your backyard, versus flying a cargo drone across state lines, or say you're inspecting 100 miles of railroad tracks. There should be like different levels of regulation or different levels of skill required for doing those different things. Another interesting point this group made was they stated risk-based / performance-based safety policies should be leveraged to ensure safe operating requirements at a natural fit with the overall operation and the established safety culture of the organization, which again is a good point and I agree with one more time. Where is the risk assessment behind the remote ID regulations? So that was just a tiny fraction of the highlights of what those 4 subgroups gave as their recommendations to the FAA. And on the last slide here, it was fun to see as a hardworking volunteer for the FPV Freedom Coalition that the FPV Freedom Coalition was listed on the thank you slide. And that brought us to the Q&A section for this tasking group number 8. And James Burgess from Google's Wing Corporation wanted to bring our attention to the fact that there is no existing safety and risk issues with flying drones today, or UAS today. He wanted to highlight the performance-based and risk-based regulations quite a few times, and that, to me, it gave a little glimpse into the thoughts about UAS at Wing. And that it kind of helps me understand where they are coming from, especially when reading their response to the remote ID NPRM, which seemed fairly positive, especially coming from a large corporation like Google. Now, at this point in the meeting, the FAA is giving their response to what the previous tasking groups submitted to the FAA back in like February and at the June DAC meeting. The UAS facility maps groups had suggested that the FAA shrink the grids used for the Lance system, and the FAA agreed that they're working on this and that they plan to implement it by late 2021. So right now each grid is like a 1 mile by 1 mile rectangle or square, and the recommendation is to shrink those in half. So each 1 mile by 1 mile square would be 4 little squares instead. And that means that instead of having one area that has a 100-foot ceiling, maybe that's split up into 4 of them, and a couple of those could be a 300 or 200-foot ceiling where just one part of it really needs to be the 100-foot ceiling. So that'll give people more options, more granular control over how high they can fly and where. But really the interesting point I wanted to make here was that the UAS Facility Maps group mentioned a lot about shielded operations and how New Zealand has this great program for shielded operations where if you fly below the treetops or near, below buildings and stuff, you're clearly out of the airspace that any aircraft are going to be in. And so why do we have to worry about manned aircraft and UAS sharing that space? Because there's never going to be manned aircraft there. But the FAA did not say anything about that part of the recommendation. And I'm just curious, why didn't they respond to that? Why didn't they mention it? They're acting like they're basically ignoring it. And you can see this in the eBook. It talks all about the shielded operations, but if you read the response then that the FAA has, they just totally ignored it. So after that, they moved on to a section where they're talking about a new tasking from the FAA. And this seems like it was brought about because the manned aircraft community believed that the remote ID is probably inadequate to affect safety, and that it's mostly there for security reasons, not safety reasons. And I agree, that remote ID is not about safety at all. It doesn't really make anything safer. It's there for security reasons and tracking people and stuff like that. So it's not even it's not about safety, even though that's been what we've been told over and over and over again, that this is all about safety, but whatever. But the manned aircraft community stated that any solutions should integrate with current avionics like ADS-B or EFB, which is clearly the opposite of what the FAA has stated in their NPRM. So it seems like the FAA doesn't like the answer they got back from the manned aircraft community. So they're creating a new task for the DAC to answer this question. Can remote ID be used to increase situational awareness between manned aviation and that routinely operates at low altitudes away from airports and UAS operating in the same airspace? So I'm curious to see what the answers will be from the DAC to the FAA when they answer this question, and how different they'll be than the answers they've already gotten from manned aviation to that question. And that brought us to the final discussion. So near the end of the meeting, James Burgess from Google's Wing once again came up on the screen and gave us another glimpse into his history with aviation. And he talked about how at a young age he got into model aircraft, and that got him into aviation, and he's got a pretty long history with all sorts of different parts of aviation. And again, that sort of reiterated for me Wing's position and how they're fairly positive to the recreational side of things. And that's, again, why I think their NPRM response was the way it was. All right, so what's my final thoughts about this? I really wonder, how can we get more people involved in this whole process? How can we get more people involved in UAS regulations? How can we get more recreational pilots involved? I did everything I could think of to try to advertise the fact that this meeting was happening. And of the 1.3 million recreational flyers in the United States, and many, many more than that around the world, almost nobody tuned in. But thanks, Bruce Simpson from New Zealand, for tuning in and trying to help out, even though you're not even in the United States. Only about 180 people were watching on YouTube and another 125 on Facebook. That's probably a lot for an FAA live stream, but in general, that's just like a tiny, tiny fraction of the people that should be seriously concerned about what's going on at the FAA and what kind of regulations they're going to be pushing our way. When I shared information about this meeting, the only comments I really got back, and a lot of people didn't comment and it did just show up on the meeting, but from the comments I got back, tons of people in the FPV community anyways are just like, I don't care, I'm just going to fly and do what I want. And I wish there was something I could do to help convince people to be a part of this process and show up and show the FAA how many of us there are and that we do care about these regulations. And if you make regulations that don't make any sense, people are going to ignore them. So what's the point of the regulation then if no one's going to follow it? That doesn't really make the skies any safer. So I'm not sure what we can do here, but if you guys have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. And that'll do it for me today, so thanks for watching. Oh, one more quick thing before I go. If you like that little tagline/logo thing I put at the end of my videos that says change your view, fly FPV, and if you get the double meaning of it, even better. But if you like that and want to have it on a t-shirt, don't forget that you can get one, just like the one I'm wearing right now. And you can also support the FPV Freedom Coalition in the process. To do that, just head over to the FPVFC's website and their store, so fpvfc.org/store, and pick one out for yourself.